The honeymoon's over for Josh Heupel. Tennessee fans are frustrated, and honestly, I don't blame them because that was an ugly performance from the Vols on Saturday in the Swamp. Maybe we should have expected it. We've seen it before. Tennessee loses its 10th in a row in Gainesville. We thought this time might be different. On paper, Tennessee seemed like it would have the better team. Didn't look that way on Saturday night. Florida won really just about in every way, established a commanding first half lead, and then rode its defense into the finish line. Josh Heupel's offense that had been so reliable throughout all of last season didn't show up on Saturday in Gainesville. Welcome into the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside the Knoxville News Sentinels, Adam Sparks and John Adams. We will unpack what happened in Gainesville and take a look ahead at what could be a pivotal moment here for Josh Heupel. UTSA up next before the Vols re-enter conference play. So, guys, like I said, maybe we should have expected this when you consider history. Tennessee struggled so much in that building over the years, but frankly, I thought the Vols were better than this. I didn't think they were I didn't think they were as good as last season. I didn't think they'd win 11 games. I thought they were better than this, and got to say, this one has me rewiring my expectations about what Tennessee might be this year. What were your impressions on what we saw Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways to look at this. We could list through what the problems are, and like today, I was talking in the media room with some of the other reporters that cover the team, and we said, "What's when you guys look on your message boards, your inboxes, your DMs, and all that, who's to blame for this loss?" And there's all different answers, but the list is like 10 different people. And it really, you're just trying to figure out where to rank those. Is it Joe Milton is a popular one? That's low hanging fruit. He's a quarterback. The offensive line. Where's Cooper Mays? I thought Cooper Mays was supposed to be back by now. Are these coaches lying that Cooper Mays is even coming back? I get that one a lot. The wide receivers aren't getting open. Joey Halsley, the offensive coordinator, does he even know what he's doing? Alex Golesh was great play caller last year. Joey Halsley must not be watching the game anymore. Get that one a lot. The tackling in the secondary is atrocious. Kamal Haddon was somebody that was picked out a whole lot in my inbox. It's a long list of people to blame. I guess just about all those that I listed could share in it. And you could tell that Josh Heupel agrees with that a little bit too, because the post game the other night, I forget exactly how he put it, but he basically said there's not one person, one player, one coach that did what they should have done in this game. And he sort of echoed that today in his press conference. There's just nothing is going well for this team right now. And it does, I mean, like what you're saying, it's a pivotal moment because had they won this game the way the rest of the SEC is, we would say, okay, the door's cracking open for Tennessee to maybe make a run, even though they haven't looked great so far. The fact that they lost it now, you're looking at things pessimistically in the opposite direction. Week and a half from now, they're playing South Carolina, and we're thinking, well, if they don't beat South Carolina, how much could this slide? How much further could this season slide? If they don't beat South Carolina, does that mean the Joe Milton experiment is over? If they don't beat South Carolina, with maybe Cooper Mays coming back, then what's to say that they could repair any of this? And I think maybe that's the more discouraging thing that I hear from Tennessee fans is that, okay, you lost, but then how is it fixed? And I think the fixes are maybe harder to envision at this point. The fixes on the offensive line may not just be Cooper Mays. The fixes in the passing game, you have your next option is a freshman, albeit talented, but a freshman quarterback. Your fixes on defense, the secondary has some problems in tackling. I don't think those guys are going to get replaced. I think they're going to be out there probably the rest of the season. And you get a lot of issues at linebacker, which I think could resurface, especially in the South Carolina game. And they've kind of run out of experienced linebackers. So there's depth issues. This team was supposed to have more depth at some key positions. They're showing that they actually have the opposite. And I think that's more discouraging than anything is that there's not quick fixes in those positions.
I guess my who's to blame list starts with Josh Heupel. Um, he's one of the best offensive coach in college football, and look what his offense has done the past 2 weeks: 30 points against Austin Peay, 16 in the Swamp. Um, and some of those deficiencies that Adam alluded to, should that have been fixed through the transfer portal at the end of last season? You should have a good idea of what's coming, what you've got. You should know your roster. Uh, but the main problem I had with that game was it appeared to me that Josh Heupel had lost confidence in his quarterback. And in the second half, when time's slipping away, the game's slipping away, it's like he was almost playing to keep it close, running the ball. And Joe Milton did throw a 55-yard touchdown pass to Brew McCoy. But to me, that was your only shot. You got to take chances. You got to go down swinging. Tennessee went down with the bat just resting comfortably on its shoulders. And I put that on Josh Heupel. I just – that did not look like a Josh Heupel team, especially like a Josh Heupel offense. I think if it's one thing, if Tennessee had lost that game 48-40, I think fans would look at it differently. They would blame the defense and say, well, Tennessee just doesn't play good defense yet. We got to recruit better players, blah, blah, blah. But Josh Heupel, nobody can stop his offense except Georgia, maybe.
I want to piggyback off of that, John. Sorry if I cut you off.
That's okay.
But the offense last year and even 2 years ago, I think the approach of the offense was we have all these options of things that could go right. Which one do we want to try on this play? And now I see the approach of the offense through 3 games is that they can think of all the things that could go wrong. And you got to figure out some way to avoid the things that could go wrong. So, to open up the game, they're giving Jalen Wright the ball, I think, 4 straight times, which makes sense. But they're basically saying, this guy we know can get positive yardage. He's not going to take it to the house. There's not a big play that we're setting up here. We just need something positive, and so we're going to give the ball to Jalen Wright. Sometimes they wouldn't throw downfield because they were scared the protection wouldn't hold up, which often it did not. Sometimes you would see them to ask Joe Milton, I think, to be somewhat conservative with the ball because they were afraid what could happen. That they like his decision making, but he's making decisions, I think, between conservative and ultra conservative, at least relative to what Josh Heupel's offense usually is. You see the tempo slowed down because the communication is slow. From Joey Halsley up in the booth down to Josh Heupel on the sideline, then to signal in the play, and then Joe Milton's having to stop the snap, pausing the snap and getting back up to the line and changing the call again. He's looking to the sideline. It looks like they're trying to figure out like the one thing that will work on this snap. And that's not where you want to be. Where they usually are is they're the aggressor and they say, we've got 10 things that could work on this play. Let's pick any of them and let's go do it now. And as opposed to that, I think they're just saying, I wonder if we could figure out anything that works. And if we can figure out that one thing, we're going to run that one play. And by then, the advantage of their tempo and being the aggressor, that's sort of out the window.
But see, Adam, I think we were past that point in the fourth quarter Saturday. I understand all the fears and concerns, but the time was running out. You couldn't win the way you were going is the way I saw it. You've got to take a chance. And, yeah, it might not work out. But this strategy won't work out either. That's why I said go down swinging. And
I do think if you look at 2 points in that game where the offense, it worked for a short period of time. It was at the beginning of the game when the plays were scripted, right? It was the first drive when plays were scripted, and that was fine. There wasn't any where they have to kind of work quickly on their feet. It was we practiced these 8 plays all week, and this is what we're going to run. And it was a game plan put together, but they didn't have to work fast in the moment. I think that could come down to changing of the coordinators a little bit. because Joey Halsley has been with Heupel for a long time, but he's not used to either calling the plays or being the number one guy to recommend the plays, Josh Heupel. So that they weren't slow at all because everything was pre-scripted. So that was the beginning of the game. That's why it went well. And then there was some at the end of the game when he hit Brew McCoy with the deep ball. They moved it a little bit. That was when they said, let's just chuck it out the window. We've got no time left. We're not going to run the ball because we don't have time to run. We're down. Well, let's just throw it around and see what happens. And I think they allowed Joe Milton to improvise a little bit. And when they let the reins off, it's not like it looked great, but it looked better and it looked a little bit more like Tennessee. I think right now they have a hard time of letting the reins off of Joe Milton because they don't trust him to make all the right decisions with the ball. And when they get beyond that opening play script, I think they're just a little sluggish in deciding what to do next.
And they didn't have the run game to bail them out as much either. I mean, the run game produced almost 500 yards through the first 2 weeks of the season. Tennessee was not. They were outplayed up front on both sides of the ball. I mean, a Florida offensive line that couldn't stop Utah's pass rush at all in week one, all of a sudden was giving Graham Mertz good protection. Tennessee only generated 1 sack. On the other side, Tennessee's defensive line was not disruptive. I mean, Florida's O-line was just throwing guys around. Trevor Etienne had gaping holes to run through. You know, Graham Mertz was looking like Danny Warfel in the first half, outplaying Joe Milton. It's just the line of scrimmage. We look at the glitz and the glamour with this offense sometimes, and we forget how dependable that offensive line was last year. I don't know if we forget it, but it's easy to sort of take it for granted how dependable that group was up front. This group has not been the case. We knew Tennessee had some concerns in the secondary anyway, and then you add in the fact that the defensive front was not disruptive, was getting handled, getting worked by Florida's offensive line. It starts to add up, and you add in Hendon Hooker's not back there. You know, I mean, I think John and I both wrote in columns. We expressed some skepticism whether Saturday was the time to turn to Nico. I don't think it was the time. In the swamp, your offensive line's getting worked over. I don't think that's the moment to hand the reins to Nico. Nonetheless, there's no denying that to this juncture in the season, Joe Milton's not been Hendon Hooker. No quarterback reasonably would have been, but there's been a drop-off there, and then there's really been a drop-off in a lot of areas, and that got exposed. Like, it was starting to get exposed against Austin Peay, but you can shrug your shoulders and say, well, it's Austin Peay. We see this happen against FCS opponents sometimes. Now they're real issues, and now I think we're approaching a critical moment for Josh Heupel, because you look at this upcoming stretch, UTSA this week, then South Carolina, Texas A&M, Alabama on the road, Kentucky on the road. These are not layups. These are not gimme games. I mean, UTSA will on paper be the easiest. UTSA is 1-2. They're not the team they were last year. But I say this is a critical moment, not just because Tennessee's coming off the loss to Florida and the honeymoon, is fading a little bit. But as you look at Josh Heupel's tenure at UCF, it was great in year one. Then it regressed a little bit in year two. And by year three, UCF was 6-4. And by the time Tennessee hired away Josh Heupel, there weren't too many UCF fans upset about that. Now, that doesn't mean anything, right? He came in and delivered the best season Tennessee's had in more than 20 years. However, if this starts to kind of fall forward here out of this Florida loss and a couple more losses in these toss-up games pop up, that's the narrative that's going to be painted about Josh Heupel, is that he was cooking with leftover ingredients, and last season was a byproduct of Hendon Hooker being a perfect fit for this system, but that maybe Heupel's enduring some growing pains that Hendon Hooker covered up. And that's why I think these next several games are important, because we know what the narrative is going to be otherwise.
Yeah, I remember in the preseason, I wrote a story that was just broke down how much of the roster were Jeremy Pruitt recruits versus Josh Heupel recruits. And it's most of the defense are Jeremy Pruitt recruits, or guys at least signed under Jeremy Pruitt, played some of their career under him. The secondary it's all seniors. Most of the defense are juniors or seniors. A good deal of the offense is as well. But once you get to the second team, that's where you transition more. And some of the offense, you transition more to Josh Heupel players. Now, that was just a breakdown in numbers that I did in the preseason. I wasn't trying to really make a point. And I don't think, sort of on your point, Blake, I think it's too early to say, whether or not this is a trend that Josh Heupel drops off after year 3. There's a lot of things.
Yeah, I agree. It's a little early at this juncture. Yeah.
But if you wanted to follow that path, like I had mentioned in the opening about issues of depth that shouldn't be there, I'll give you one on the offense and one on the defense. On the offensive line, the interior of the offensive line has played terribly through 3 games, and you saw that exposed even more. The pass rush the pass rush just blew up through the middle through Tennessee's O-line. The interception that Joe Milton threw, the interior of the line got bulldozed into him. The third and short and fourth and short plays, those have not worked all season, regardless of the competition, and it's because, again, that the middle of that offensive line is getting pushed back. Well, we can say it's because Cooper Mays, their standout center, is not out there, but that's one player. They moved their guard, Ollie Lane, to center. They moved their backup tackle, Dane Davis, to center. So now you've got problems at guard, but also at center. You've got questions of depth at tackle. That shouldn't fall apart because of one player, but, the guys that they recruited so far, you don't want to call out a bunch of guys that are still redshirt freshmen and sophomores, but like Addison Nichols, for example. Addison Nichols was 2 years ago, if I remember, the top rated recruit in that class for Josh Heupel. He was a 4-star guy, really smart kid, high level recruit. He's practiced at center for the last year and a half. They wanted him to be at center or guard, and right now they need a center or guard, and he can't get a snap on the field with the ones, and sometimes not with the twos. So that's an example of a guy that was supposed to be ready by now, that is not ready. Maybe he'll be on down the line, but he's not ready right now when they need him. On defense, Keenan Peely goes down, similar to Cooper Mays, goes down. They didn't expect it, but he's out with an injury, and they're plugging in Elijah Herring, who was a high-level signee a year ago. So suddenly you have a true sophomore starting at linebacker, and behind him is Arian Carter and Jeremiah Thielander. Those are true freshmen, good recruits, but they're not ready to be plugged into those positions. And on the defensive side, the other night, Josh Heupel even alluded to it in his presser today that some of the issues that giving up runs was not just the missed tackles in secondary. It was guys. He said at the linebacker level, guys were going in the wrong gap. Sometimes they were a step slow to react. They would go in the wrong gap. I think he's talking about Elijah Herring, but I think he's maybe also talking about those freshmen. That they're guys that should be getting some snaps, but not put into those situations, those huge situations that early on. It's because they don't have enough depth at that position, proven depth. And so those are 2 areas where you should be able to absorb an injury. And they had an injury at center and an injury at linebacker, and that's already costing them a whole lot of real estate on the field. And so I don't subscribe necessarily right now to that they haven't restocked the roster well enough, but I think it's reasonable to look at places like that and at least monitor that.
I go back to the preseason outlook. And Tennessee knew it was short on linebackers, and it goes out and gets Keenan Peely from BYU. It knew it had some issues at DB, so it goes out and gets a Gabe Judy Lolly also at BYU. But I just wonder if it should have done more in the transfer portal, because that was an awful secondary last season. And now that we've seen the Florida game, it still looks like a subpar secondary. So I just wonder if those are the kind of evaluations that need to be made in the offseason. And should Tennessee, do you think, should it have done more work in the transfer portal with offensive linemen. I know last year, Billy Napier, when he went from Louisiana to Florida, he took with him an all-Southland Conference offensive lineman, Osiris Torrance, who became a high draft pick this past season, high-round draft pick in the past draft. Tennessee, I just wonder if it should have done more work in the transfer portal in both those areas, offensive line and secondary.
Well, I'll jump on that one. Their starting left guard right now is Carrick, Andre Carrick from Texas. That's a transfer. Hadn't panned out. Maybe a bad evaluation. Maybe he just wasn't ready, but he didn't pan out. In the secondary, yes, they brought in Gabe Judy Lawley, but I think you can see from Tim Banks, the defensive coordinator, that he has this reputation, for better or worse, now in his third year. He does not like to bring up young guys in the secondary. The older, the better. And those are all seniors. There's seniors, there's fifth-year seniors, there's sixth-year seniors. He does not believe, you can just tell by his actions, even if he says otherwise, he does not believe in putting a young, talented player in the game when he's got super old players, even if they've been just adequate or serviceable or mediocre. He wants to keep older players in the game. So I think they looked in the offseason and said, we'll take a DB, and they did take one, but we don't necessarily have to have a DB because all these old guys are coming back, despite the fact that they didn't play well last year. All these old guys are coming back. I'll look at a guy like Andre Turrentine, Innsworth kid out of Nashville, talented player, was at Ohio State, transferred to Tennessee, a little over a year ago. In preseason practice, they said, he makes phenomenal plays, but he takes a lot of risks. He's sort of high risk, high reward guy at safety. He's barely played. They've only played two safeties. They haven't given Turrentine a place. And you can see in the high risk, high reward, perspective, I guess, of him is why he would not play. Yeah, he may pick off a pass, but then he's going to give up a long pass. And we don't want that. We only want guys that can play safe. And so I think that just influences things. And really, if you look at it, what Tennessee is not doing in its secondary, it goes along with the same argument about what they should do at quarterback on the other side of the ball. In the defensive secondary, you have 4 stars, high 4-star, talented young DBs, a lot of freshmen that are not playing in the secondary because we trust the older guys. Even if the older guys aren't great, they're older guys and we just trust them. At quarterback, you've got Nico, the 5-star, who hasn't played a lot, but the idea is we trust Joe Milton. He's an older guy. We know what we're going to get out of him, for better or worse. And I think those are two different evaluations, but I think it's sort of the same mindset. And I think the deeper into the season this goes, especially probably really determinant on how the South Carolina game goes, you're going to see fan bases take sides even more about, do you stick with the old guys and see how the season can end up, or do you just say, forget it, let's go the youth movement? And I think we're probably a couple weeks from that argument coming up.
Well, let's dive into that further, because that's where I wanted to go next. So this is a good segue with Joe Milton. I think we're in agreement that throwing him out there in the second half Saturday was probably not the right moment. Throwing Nico out there in the second half was probably not the right moment, and that there were more problems in that game than just your quarterback. However, Adam, you just hit on it there. Like, if this goes south, at what point do you pull the plug and go to younger guys? That can apply to quarterback in particular. Joe Milton is the veteran senior, 6-year senior. This is the end of his eligibility. Nico is the future. Wasn't time for the future in week 3. When does it get to be time for the future? If Tennessee loses to South Carolina in a couple weeks, they lose to Texas A&M. Like, my argument would be, I don't know if Nico is going to be an improvement. In some ways, I think he will be. In some ways, maybe not. My thought is, if this is going to head down the path of an 8-4 or a 7-5 season, sorry, but go with the freshman, play for the future. Like, I'd rather, in any situation, I'd rather go 7-5 with a freshman or 8-4 than do that with a senior. Maybe that's not the way it used to work in college football, but it's not 1974 anymore. Nico's your guy going forward. He's your 5-star freshman. If Joe Milton can rebound, if this offense can rebound, you stick with him. That maybe that gives you the highest ceiling. But if this doesn't get better in the next couple weeks, by October, I'm thinking about Nico.
Yeah, I had this exact same conversation in the airport Sunday in Florida, flying back. My wife and I were sitting with 2 Tennessee fans that we met, reasonable fans, I'll say, because they sort of made the same point that you did, Blake. They said that was not the place to throw Nico in the swamp and, get shell shocked in that environment. But there is some point where you need to think about transitioning from Joe to Nico, even if a lot of these things that are going on are not Joe Milton's fault. At what point do you think that through? And I asked these 2 Tennessee fans, I said, well, okay, well, give me a record. If I tell you that Joe Milton, if you stick with Joe Milton throughout the entire season, you can go 9-3. Do you stick with Joe Milton and not go to Nico? And they said, absolutely. If you can go 9-3, you stick with Joe Milton. I said, okay. If I tell you you can go 8-4, if you stay with Joe Milton all the way, do you do that? And both of them said, nah, nope. If you're going to go 8-4, and that's the ceiling with Joe Milton, pull the plug and go with Nico and see what happens. Now, we did talk that through more of when do you do that? And they both said South Carolina's the game. Now, you can say a South Carolina the game when you roll Nico out there. I think more so it's the South Carolina game is when you give Joe Milton a chance. There's other layers to this argument. Cooper Mays is not back yet. Maybe he's back this week. Maybe he's back for the South Carolina game. Fairness can't necessarily always be brought into this, but is it fair for Joe Milton to be behind an offensive line that's getting, just run over, and then for Nico to come in and suddenly get the preseason All-SEC center in front of him and the offensive line be repaired? I don't know that that's fair. I think you need to let Joe Milton play with the center and see how that goes before anything happens. But that may happen this week or next. I think South Carolina is very pivotal because if you buy into what those Tennessee fans were saying, that 8-4, that's not good enough if you're going to stick with Joe Milton. Well, if they lose to South Carolina, let's say with Milton, that's 2 losses. Let's say you lose to Georgia, that's 3 losses. Who knows what Alabama is right now, but you lose to Alabama or Texas A&M, that's a 4th loss. And, at some point, probably you are pulling the plug and going with Nico, just even if Nico is not necessarily an upgrade. I do think this week's game is important because I think 2 things need to happen for Nico to replace Joe Milton. I think the season needs to slide enough that you're not going to win a ton of games with Joe Milton. So you just make the transition. Like we said, 8-4 or 9-3 or whatever. You got to find out a time or what the ceiling is. Number 2, Nico has to play reasonably well to earn a chance. And that could happen this week. Maybe he gets a few series. Maybe he gets a quarter. Maybe Nico plays the entire second half. It really depends on what the score is. You really missed a chance to play Nico a lot that the Austin Peay game is close because he would have needed those reps. But if Nico goes into the UTSA game this week and plays poorly or just doesn't show a whole lot, that's probably going to delay things because right now Joe Milton is the better quarterback for Tennessee than Nico. I have no question about that. But if Nico comes out and plays pretty well and you think, oh, there's something here, the more reps we give this guy, the better he's going to be, then you start thinking it through during that bye week after the South Carolina game, only if you lose to South Carolina. If they beat UTSA this week with Joe Milton, they beat South Carolina with Joe Milton next week, then you go into the bye week and you say, okay, things are in a decent shape, and let's see if we can make a run in October against an SEC that's kind of down. And who knows, if you can get things fixed incrementally after that, you can go to Tuscaloosa and repeat that whole thing. And we could be talking about a different season. But it comes down to South Carolina, what happens there, and it comes down to whether or not Nico shows them something probably this week.
Adam, when you were talking about that, I was thinking big picture. You talk about the promising young DBs that maybe not playing yet, not because of lack of ability, but lack of experience. You talk about the 5-star quarterback, Nico, waiting in the wings. So you seem like you've got talent to come. But when you look at that offensive line, what do you think of the going forward? How promising is it next year for Tennessee's offensive line?
I mean, Spraggins, Javonte Spraggins, the right guard, is considered, at least in some circles, he's an NFL draft guy. I mean, in the offseason, some people had him as a first-round pick. I don't know necessarily that's going to happen. I'm not a great evaluator of offensive linemen. But Spraggins is a senior. He'll be gone. He'll go into the draft. Jeremiah Crawford and Gerald Mincy could come back. Campbell is a fifth-year senior. The Miami transfer, he basically came here to get to the NFL. So if he thinks he can get drafted even late, I think he's probably gone. So, I mean, next year, if this year doesn't go great, next year could be worse. And maybe that goes to the bigger point of when do you play Nico? And John, to your point, when do you play those young DBs? Because if those young DBs never play a sizable number of snaps this year, then a lot of these seniors are gone. And then you're rebuilding the secondary with guys that haven't played. If you only have a mediocre year, 7-5 or something, and Joe Milton plays the whole way, then you go into next year where you're trying to find somebody in the portal at quarterback, and then Nico hasn't even played, and you've got an offensive line that has holes this year and would then have more holes next year, and you'd be trying to repair that in the transfer portal. That didn't work great this offseason. So it could absolutely get worse. And so I guess that goes to the bigger point that you have to think about this season, but you also have to think when you get into October and November of when do you finally just start repairing things with the big picture in mind, the big picture being next season.
Guys, quick thing before we go out the door. We were buying into Tennessee after week 1, but we had the caveat. We knew Virginia was not a good opponent. And for the most part, we said we weren't revising our preseason predictions. So now I want to take the temperature after week 3 and this, let's call it a debacle. That's what it was in Gainesville. Are you revising your preseason predictions after Saturday? I'll lead us off, give you guys a chance to think it over. As I've said numerous times now, preseason, I had Tennessee at 9-3. I did not revise my prediction after Virginia, although I was encouraged after that game. Didn't take a lot out of that one, knowing the opponent. I am taking something out of these last 2 weeks where we've seen Tennessee struggle, and particularly that offensive line is a concern for me. I'm revising down to 7-5. I look at Georgia. I look at Alabama. I look at Texas A&M. I think that's 4 right there because you already got the Florida game. I know A&M, they've got the loss to Miami. Then all it takes is South Carolina on the road at Kentucky. Missouri's sitting here at 3-0 with a top 25 win. I'm revising all the way to 7-5.
I picked 9-3 in the preseason. I had this conversation with some in our KnoxNews Vols text group about, why was there so much hype and why was this team so overrated in the preseason? I made the point. I said, well, it depends on whose rating you were listening to. Because I never said they were going 10-2. I never said
that was John.
That's John. Yeah, I never said they were going to a college playoff or anything like that. I picked 9-3. Now, if I could revise my pick now, I would say 8-4. But we had this thing that we published the first game week, a couple days before the Virginia game, where what we call bold predictions, which I hate those, but we have to do them. That's sort of the hot takes. One of my bold predictions was that Tennessee would play in a Florida Bowl this year. And I said the most likely I thought would be the Citrus Bowl because that's where a 9-3 type team would go. But right after that, I said the next most likely would be the Outback Bowl or the Gator Bowl. The Outback is now called the Rely Quest Bowl, but whatever, same bowl. Or the Gator Bowl because that's where 8-4 teams go. And that was sort of my way of saying if they're not 9-3, they're 8-4. And so I don't feel terrible about that pick right now because I think 8-4 is reasonable. If they go 7-5, boy, that bye week after South Carolina could be pretty interesting because you're going to see a whole lot of people react in very, very extreme ways, the opposite of how they reacted around this time last year. But we'll see. They could fix some things. There's some place they could repair, but 8-4 is where I would revise mine if I could.
Well, I think Tennessee will be 4-1 after the next two games. I just don't think South Carolina is much of a threat, particularly in Neyland Stadium. But I didn't think it was much of a threat last year in Columbia, and it won by 25 points. So there you go. Yeah, I had Tennessee 10-2, preseason, top 10 team, all that kind of good stuff. That looks really stupid right now. So I'm going to 8-4. But it's like 8-4, but I feel like the 8-4 is closer to 7-5 than 9-3. It's an 8-4, but it's teetering, and it could fall to where what Blake said was 7-5.
All right. Well, that's what a loss to Florida does, evidently. Tennessee can restore some confidence this week against UTSA. You follow along with all the coverage at KnoxNews.com, and we will be back with you here next week. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.